asking, Max, what's up with Canada? What's going on with Canada? People in Canada want to know what's going on with Canada. So we have Nicole Foss here in the studio, back on the Kaiser Report. Nicole, welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, you've spent a lot of time in Canada, Nicole.
I have. I live there. I've lived there for the last 10 years. I also grew up there. So although I was born in England, I've spent more than half my life in Canada.
All right. Now, a couple of questions. First of all, the Canadian banks are viewed as rock solid, and they did not have the kind of problems that other banks around the world have had during this subprime meltdown. You know, they had a big reform movement not too long ago, and I guess this set the stage for having a lot better sound policies in place. Are these banks as bulletproof as we are led to believe?
Not at all. And there are not that many of them. There has been a lot of consolidation, but there are not that many. They're not highly liquid. And although we didn't have subprime in the same way they did in America, sort of lending $500,000 to Walmart greeters to buy enormous houses, we didn't have that, but we did have 40-year mortgages with no down payment. These were the people who were driving marginal prices in red-hot markets like Vancouver. Even now, although we don't have that anymore, we have 35-year mortgages with 5% down, which is still a pretty extreme situation from the point of view of offering credit. The average house price in Vancouver is over $1 million. So basically, when that bubble bursts, that is going to have tremendous consequences for the Canadian banking system.
Okay, so this housing market in Canada is still, at the moment, you could characterize it as being on the upswing.
It's peaking at the moment,
okay,
I would argue.
You're saying this Canadian housing market is peaking. Mm-hmm. And in spots like Vancouver with $1 million shacks, clearly, and the mania. You see signs of the mania. People in Canada watching this right now are coughing up a lung. They're saying, how dare you suggest that this market's in a bubble? Don't you understand we're Canadian? And the kind of mentality you see, is that, this is what I gather. Are you noticing this as well, this kind of entrenched mentality?
Absolutely. This is the psychology of a bubble. When you're in a bubble, you can't see it for what it is. So I find talking to people about real estate in Canada is like talking to Americans in 2006. There's this tremendous sense of denial. And in Canada, there's this real sense that we're special, we're an energy superpower, our banks are fine, these are other people's problems. And I'm telling you, they're absolutely not other people's problems. We just haven't seen them yet. Our economy held up longer than the U.S., partly because the Canadian dollar is a petrocurrency. And so we had a lot of support from the oil industry into the end of 2008. But nevertheless, we are in a massive bubble right now, and there is going to be an enormous comeuppance. Canadians are terribly in debt, more so than anyone else in the world, really, in terms of level of personal debt. People pay 50% of their income on average for mortgage costs. In places like Vancouver, it would be 70%. That is a very substantial fraction of income. And this is absolutely a bubble, not just in red-hot places like Vancouver, but, I mean, St. John's, Newfoundland, where there's the oil industry offshore, or Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. These are places that never had any money at all, but the prices have absolutely skyrocketed. They've just seen parabolic increases, and this is absolutely characteristic of a bubble.
Now, the banks, it seems, let me get your take on this. It seems that because the banking system in Canada, it did go through a crisis recently, and they reformed the system. They did offer a lot of consolidation. There's really a monopoly in the Canadian banking system. They're allowed to, for example, it's not very competitive, so the fees one is in charge in the Canadian banking system are quite high, and this gives them a pretty strong revenue base. But so what I'm getting from you is that the crisis, the global crisis, the global real estate meltdown, it's deferred in Canada. They didn't escape it. It's just been deferred.
Yeah, we are going to be playing catch-up to the downside in the fairly near future, I would think. And what we've already seen in the United States and a lot of parts of Europe, most notably Ireland, these dynamics are absolutely coming to Canada. It's just a question of when. I don't think it will be that long. The banking system, apart from its exposure to real estate, and there's also a tremendous commercial real estate problem. Commercial real estate, we haven't seen that fall even in the United States yet. It is absolutely coming. Canadian banks have also acted as reinsurers in the derivatives market for a number of extremely risky things. So I think we're going to see that in a number of cases the buck stops with a Canadian bank, and we haven't seen the collapse that is coming in the derivatives market yet. We're still in the extend and percent phase where we haven't seen price discovery and mark to market. It is coming, and when it does, it is going to knock out the sports from under Canadian banks just as much as it will other banks.
Okay, so by, let's say, peak to trough, Canadian real estate, top to bottom, what's your prognosis there? How much of a collapse are you talking about?
Well, I imagine real estate falling, and people will think this is extreme, by about 90% on average, which is a very large number.
I do that for cutaway shots. Later, in post-production, you see me doing this a lot. It's a cheap effect, I guess. You see, it's all very exciting. So, 90%.
Yes, and 90%, the way you get to a 90% fall in real estate prices is, imagine a credit collapse, which is where we're going. We're moving to a deflationary credit collapse. So your pool of buyers ends up being the people who can buy a property for cash, do not need to borrow money to do this, and who choose to use incredibly scarce cash for that purpose at that time. That pool of buyers will be extremely small, and so you can get enormous price collapses when you simply undercut price support at anything remotely like current levels.
Okay, so the only holdout so far in this global real estate nightmare, you've got Canada. I guess Australia is still, frothy, much to Steve Keen's consternation. But okay, Canada. The other is the banking system. Is the economy as reliant on what Dr. Michael Hudson calls the FIRE economy? Finance, insurance, and real estate. Is a lot of the GDP based on all of the services and all the financing and all of that coming into it? So we see that whole domino effect. Once the real estate prices start to collapse, you see all the jobs in the mortgage service area, the real estate, all this. It's a big domino thing. This is yet to come, and it's a similar situation, and we're going to see it in Canada.
Absolutely. 20% of GDP is to do with home construction.
20% of GDP home construction.
I don't have the figures in my head for
it's
insurance
a big swack.
And financial services, but it is going to be absolutely massive. And this is a huge overexposure to the very things that are at the center of this financial crisis. So absolutely Canada is going to suffer in the same way that everybody else does with the collapse of finance and insurance and real estate. We do have a fairly large manufacturing economy, but everything we manufacture, 80% of everything we manufacture, we sell to America.
Right.
So when Americans can no longer afford to buy our goods, our manufacturing sector is going to take a massive hit, as we've already seen with the auto industry, and that is not finished yet, by the way. This is still in the fairly early stages of collapse.
Okay. Canadian dollar supported in large part due to oil. You refer to it just as a petrocurrency. And we've got huge oil reserves in the form of the tar sands or oil sands around that. Alberta, I guess, is concentrated in that area. A couple of questions. Number one, is it cost effective? And is the loss of the U.S. export market a negative? And is this going to be enough to offset all the other economic problems? And therefore, is the Canadian dollar, is it also vulnerable?
The Canadian dollar is going to be vulnerable for a couple of reasons. The U.S. dollar should show significant strength on the deflation of dollar-denominated debt, which will create demand for dollars. So I think as the U.S. dollar shows significant strength, the Canadian dollar will weaken in comparison, partly because of the dynamics for the U.S. dollar, but also because of a fall in oil prices. I mean, you mentioned tar sands. Tar sands are essentially an arbitrage between a gaseous fuel, natural gas, and a liquid fuel in the form of Syncrude. There's very little net energy gain in doing that. You put in almost as much energy as you get out.
Syncrude is what? Synthetic crude?
Synthetic crude oil, yes.
But so it's crude oil. It comes from the... what is it exactly? Tar sands is...
It's tar surrounding sand grains, but you have to put a lot of energy in to melt it, to separate it from the sand grains.
So instead of a well that I'm drilling through rock and I find a reservoir of oil that I suck up, I've got instead a geological formation, which is a lot of oil is just infused into the crust, basically. You don't go and pull it out. You've just got a kind of a swamp of rock and oil.
You can either, if you have a surface deposit, you can scoop it up and take it away that way and then melt the bitumen off the sand. Or if it's a deep deposit, you can actually pump the heat down and then pump the liquid oil up as you have melted it down there. So there are two different ways of doing it.
So this heating, that's a lot of energy.
Enormous amount of energy.
So the energy to heat it up and extract, you're saying, is neutral or negative.
Yeah, you get almost no more energy out than you put in.
Okay.
And natural gas is likely to be a more valuable fuel in the future anyway, because conventional natural gas peaked in 2001. So using enormous reserves of natural gas to turn it into energy into the form of Syncrude, I think is just completely ridiculous. And of course you destroy northern Alberta in the process, and you have an incredibly water-dependent process going on in a very water-constrained environment where it could be oil sands at the expense of farming or ranching or even people living in some of these areas. The water constraints could be so significant.
Right, that is huge. The water required to process. But we're seeing with global warming, which some like to deny exists, man-made global warming, that, of course, even the supply of water around the world is becoming scarce.
Yes, I mean, as you get the melting of the glaciers, you could actually lose the source for some of these rivers. So what is now a water-constrained area could become a drastically more water-constrained area. And what you do with tar sands, you create these massive tailing ponds that are so toxic that birds that land on them never take off again.
What happened in Canada? It seems like a geological wasteland suddenly. I mean, I think a lot of people didn't realize that over the past 20 years, Canada's gone from being kind of a hippie-free zone to being a quasi-military petro gulag.
Well, I wouldn't call
Is that an exaggeration?